Texas. I'm professor of medicine at Texas A&M College of Medicine on the Baylor Dallas campus. I have my clinical practice there, so I see and examine patients every day with internal medicine and cardiovascular problems. I'm the current president of the Cardiorenal Society of America. It's a national medical society. I am the editor-in-chief of Cardiorenal Medicine.
For some people who think COVID is basically just the seasonal flu and maybe a bit worse. Obviously every year old people die from the flu. And in Australia, there's actually been no excess deaths from COVID whatsoever. So what would you say to someone who just says, oh, it's just the flu? What would you say?
Some people think COVID-19 doesn't exist or SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist. And I was just reading an analysis from Australia that opined along those lines. And I tend to disagree. I think it's real. And for the following reasons, is both the Chinese as well as labs in the United States sequence the virus. We can identify the virus in individuals. It's not influenza. It's the virus. It's SARS-CoV-2. Its entire genetic code is known. So in the United States, we rely on a lab in California headed up by Dr. Sabine Hazen that's clearly demonstrated the virus is there. And we knew early on that there was a blend of variants of the virus in every population. The other major difference between influenza and COVID-19 is that influenza itself is rarely the immediate problem that leads to severe illness and hospitalization. It's almost always a bacterial secondary pneumonia. In fact, a staphylococcal pneumonia is most common. So in my practice, I remember in 2018, 2019, we had some serious patients at my hospital that I was rounding on, and they had influenza, but the real problem was a secondary staphylococcal pneumonia. With COVID-19, it's quite interesting. There is a low rate of any secondary bacterial infections. It's almost COVID all the way. And instead of a secondary bacterial infection, COVID-19 does something very different than the flu. Is it creates cytokine storm or an abnormal immune system activation, and then devastating thrombosis, microthrombosis and macrothrombosis. And we don't see that in influenza. So I'm pretty convinced they're two separate illnesses.
Coronaviruses have been around for decades. They're never going to go away. So what is different about this?
The difference between SARS-CoV-2, and the COVID-19 illness and the others appears to be genetic modification of the spike protein, so-called gain-of-function research. It looked like it was intentionally made in a laboratory in Wuhan, China, the Chinese Institute of Virology. That's where the action was, to make the virus far more contagious and far more dangerous. And it's the spike protein itself, the spicule on the surface of the virus, that really confers the pathogenicity of the virus. That's what makes the virus so deadly, is the spike protein.
But would you actually classify it a pandemic?
I think it's fair to say it's a pandemic. It's certainly broad enough, and it's occurred in clusters.